Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, your child librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to talk about a kind of favorite book of mine. I've read it more than once. Alice Walker's The Color Purple. So it is February. It is African American History Month, so I'm covering some African American books. It's also the month of the Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year. So I'm also covering Asian books this month. So this book and the Good Luck Club are the two more adult-ish late teen books that I am covering this month. The rest are going to be children's picture books or like basically geared toward little kids. So this is the most upper level book that I'm going to cover besides the Joy Luck Club. So I'm doing one of each. So, and I'm also going to cover the films for both. So let's get in. I enjoyed this book. In fact, I just finished rereading it, which is the reason I'm filming this in June. I read it back in high school. I enjoyed it then. I re-borrowed it from my library, which is the reason I don't have a physical copy. It's on my list to buy. I do want a physical copy of this book, but I borrowed it from my public library in ebook form, and I wanted to when it was fresh in my mind. So I really enjoy this book. You do not want to, this is not for anybody under 9th grade. Just don't go there. I don't care how mature you think your kid is. This book literally starts off with woman dying and this our main character, which is Celie, her father, the man who's raised her, he's actually her stepfather, we find that out much later, essentially has raped her. So, and that pretty much starts off with it. Her mother gives birth to her final child. Is slightly crazy. We find out more about that later. And has gone off to stay with her sister or something. And Celie is the oldest. She has a younger sister, Nellie, and then there's a bunch of like other children. So essentially he rapes her twice. She's probably in her early teens when this starts. She gives birth first to a girl and then to a boy. He claims he's taken them off to kill her. He tells her, don't you dare tell your mother what I did. So the mother assumes that she had sex with somebody else. She's under age of 18 when this happens. And it traumatizes her body enough, giving birth to these two kids, that her menstrual cycle stops. So that is the very beginning of this book. That is how this begins. So no, nothing lower than 9th grade, and I would be careful even with that age. Personally, I wouldn't get it anywhere near into maybe junior, just because of what this, particularly how it starts. Now you'd know your kid and what you want exposed to them, but I'm probably not going to expose my daughter to this, no matter, probably depending on her maturity level, not until she's at least 13 or 14. Because also some of this is going to go over her head. It's just not going to make sense. So that's how to start books. It's interestingly formatted here. Most of the book, through a decent part of it, is Celie's letters essentially to God. So, and even though this is a secular channel, that's not what this means. There's a whole introduction in the copy that I read by Alice Walker who talks about some of the background of African slavery and how she came to be writing this book in, I believe, Washington State. She was looking for a place to, and she, I think, currently living in Northern California. But in this garden where basically she rented a house to write this book out in nature. Right after her divorce. So I think this book was written in the early 80s. So, and essentially it's not religious in nature. Celie is writing to God as a way to tell her story. And eventually it does change because you also have the combination of her sister Nellie's letters to her that she eventually gets a hold of and reads. And then she switches from writing to God to writing to her sister. So essentially she uses these letters essentially to God as a way of telling her story. And so you have her story where she's given birth to these two kids. She realizes they're not dead. Her father has given them to somebody else. You find that out more about later, what goes on. And then there's another man who's only referred to as Mr. His first name is Albert. You find that out later, but that's how she refers to it. It's literally written Mr. dot, and then there's a long underscore. So she just pretty much takes out the last name. So there is no last name. She referred to him as Mr. Whatever his last name was. He wants her little sister Nellie, because Nellie is younger and Nellie is prettier, and their father won't give her to him. He might want her for himself. He has a thing for younger girls. By this time, he has remarried someone who's around Celie's age. So what he ends up doing is, instead of Mr. keeps approaching him, it's like, here, I'm going to give you Celie. She can't have kids anymore, so you can have sex with her as much as you darn well please. And yes, that's what he says. Essentially, you need somebody to take care of your house and your kids because your wife was murdered by her lover. And yeah, that was a thing on her way back to her front church. She's killed by her lover. So Celie is not legally married, but essentially given to Mr. to take care of his house, basically to act as a wife, though they never legally married. So they don't marry in the church. His children are horrible. Nellie, their pa, that's what she refers to him, goes after Nellie. Nellie runs away, goes to stay with Celie, but of course Mr. wants her. And so when she spurns and advances, he basically tells Celie it's like she has to go. She needs to go. Now, Celie had been in town once and saw her daughter. So she recognized her daughter and talked to the woman by the name of Corina and found out who her husband was. So she sends Nellie to them. It's like, this is the only people I know with money. And then Celie disappears. And you hear more about Celie's life. So Nellie disappears for part of the books. So you hear about Celie's life. It's miserable. She's pretty much used as basically something for Mr. to have sex with, and deals with his children and cooks and cleans and deals with this guy's kids. The oldest boy, Harpo, grows up. When he's about 17, he falls in love with this girl by the name of Sophia, who's a large African-American woman, comes from a strong family. All the women in their family are very strong and very opinionated. They're not meek like Celie is. Celie just does exactly what she's told. She has no spine whatsoever because she's been beaten down by life. So, and then you kind of get their story. Harpo's trying to control her in the background, what happens. And then for a while, they have kids. Obviously, Harpo and Sophia have children. She takes her kids and leaves. And then he starts up a juke joint, which is basically, this is the 20s, so it's the African versions of a speakeasy in the back swamps. So he starts out an affair. Sophia comes back. He tries to control her. She ends up getting in a fight with the mayor and his wife and ends up in prison. And then through some connections, she ends up spending like 11 years as the maid to the mayor's wife, essentially raising his kids. She's beaten the crap out of because she essentially disobeys a white man. And this is the 1920s. So, and she becomes essentially a slave. She's living in a room below their house for years, and she's barely able to see her own kids, who are then raised by her sister's husband, who they can't have children, Harpo, and his lover, whose real name is Mary Agnes, who is known mostly by the name of Squeak for a long time, because she's also very, very meek. The other major character in this book is Suge Avery. And she's the woman that Albert, or Mr., is in love with. Then Celie falls in love with her. And now she kind of knew about Suge before she was married to Mr. Because again, that's how Celie refers to him. Because she hears about him being obsessed with her before she's married to him. And she asks her stepmother, who's close to her age, to figure out who she is. And this young woman, gets a picture of Suge Avery to Seeley, and Seeley falls in love with this picture. So both Seeley and Mister are in love with the same woman. Suge shows up at one point in time. She's very, very sick. It doesn't exactly explain what's going on with her. She's on death's door. She does not die. And Seeley nurses her back to her health. She's a very nasty, nasty woman at this point. She swears. She's mean to everybody. Albert's absolutely obsessed with this woman and hates the fact that Seeley isn't her. But Seeley and Suge end up having an affair. So that's the other part of the story. So this is what's all this is going on. Eventually what Suge does now, Suge leaves and then comes back married to a man by the name of Grady. By this time, Suge is a singer. So she has money. She's singing all over the place, all over the country. So she comes back with money in a car and all fancied up. She is from that town. Her family won't have anything to do with her because she's a loose woman. So she comes back with Grady, and both Albert and Seeley aren't particularly happy about it because all of a sudden she's married to this younger man who basically is using her money. But during this visit is where Suge starts asking Seeley about her sister Nellie, and eventually comes about that Suge will occasionally go to the mailbox because Nellie swore to her sister that she would write to her, and she never does, supposedly. It comes to find out that she has been writing, but Albert's been keeping letters from her. So they find the letters, and Seeley starts reading them. One, she becomes enraged because he's basically kept her sister from her. And she finds out what happened to her sister. Now, after her sister left, Albert followed her, and he tried to rape her. But she got away. And she got to the house of this minister and his wife. And she sees the two children. She realizes, oh, these are my sister's kids. And these are very religious people. They're Samuel and Corina are the names. They're raising the children. They couldn't have children. They're planning on being missionaries to Africa. And they end up, because somebody gets married and of their missionary group and leaves, Nellie goes along with them. So they travel to New York, then to London, then to Lisbon, and then they're off, then to Liberia, and they're moved into another village. I can't remember where it is off the top of my head, but it's interior of Africa, to this village where they are they're missionaries. They're setting up hospitals, they're setting up schools. They're trying to convert the native people who are essentially living in the jungle. The problem is, this is the 1920s. The English are still taking over Africa like crazy, and they're building roads and rubber fields. So the road is coming, and the road comes to the village, and it stops one day, and it kind of had come to slowly. It takes like 5 years since the missionary groups had arrived there, and then it plows right through the town. The town doesn't realize, it's like, oh, you're not stopping. You are basically, this Englishman now owns all your land. And the road is going through, and the chief doesn't really get it. He goes to the port and realizes, yeah, your land is now owned. Nobody gives a damn. Go away. And you have to pay for water rights for your wells, and we're going to turn everything into rubber plantations. So that's what's going on. So there's that. That's about 5 years after they get there, and you get Nellie's story of how she's helping raise her sister's kids and how she found that another interesting story eventually. Their father's not their father. So this is many, many years later. The children are nearly adults at this point. The village they've been staying at is almost completely destroyed. The world's been turned upside down. They're now pretty much enslaved and tenant farmers for these plantation owners doing rubber plantation close to this time. And Corina has slowly been slightly going crazy. She's become very protective of Samuel. She becomes very, very suspicious of Nellie. Now, in this village, it's common for husbands to have multiple wives, and that's well known. So the villagers think that Nellie and Corina are both Samuel's wives, which they're not. And Corina slowly gets more and more paranoid over the years. and eventually she gets sick. I believe she has malaria, because a lot of people are dying of malaria, because it's West Africa. Not to mention they also have sickle cell anemia, which isn't mentioned by name in this book, but it's very much implied because they don't know what it is at that time, so it doesn't have a name. So eventually, and these are all through Nellie's letters, you find out her story. And eventually Corina dies, but before this, she finds out this story because Corina's convinced, like, are you these children's mother? She's like, no, I'm their aunt. And so Corina had gotten in her head that her husband had an affair with Nellie and the children were theirs. And it's like, no, I met him, but they both swear on the Bible. It's like, no, we met the same day I met you. And eventually she learns from Samuel that he had been friends with who Nellie assumed was their father. He wasn't. Their biological father was a wealthy, well-to-do, successful African American who ran a store, who owned this land, who owned the house they were growing up in. And eventually the whites got pissed off and lynched him. They beat him to death. And her mother, Celie, was already born. She was 2 years old at this time, and her mother was pregnant with Nellie. So she gave birth to Nellie early when she saw her husband's body, and essentially went crazy. And then Samuel's friend, who comes down, I'm assuming from New York, finds her, basically turns her into a sex slave. She's crazy, abuses the kids, takes over land that's not his, and she has like 6 more kids and then proceeds to die. So, and he takes over the land. So Celie finds this out in a letter and goes to see him. He's married to some child who's young enough to be his bloody daughter. And he's built a whole big fancy house. And he's become successful because he's taken over somebody else's land and somebody else's store. He doesn't give a crap that he's stolen this. He's like, so what? Your father was stupid. Now I have it. And I'm not arrogant like he is. So, and that's that. She does this with Suge. Now again, Celie's reading all this. She's getting pissed off. Suge has to convince her not to kill Albert because she's pissed off. It's like, you've kept this from me. You kept my sister from me. You kept somebody who loved me from me for all of these years. Because by the time she gets the letters, Harpo, who was like 16, is now like in his 30s. So they're older by the time she finds this out. So she might be in her 30s or 40s at this point. So she eventually, what ends up happening is around this time, Sophia's out on parole. So this is 11 years later. They're eating, I think, at the sisters Olympia's place. And Suge has decided, along with Grady, to leave. And they're going to take both Celie and Squeak, whose real name is Mary Agnes, with them to Memphis, Tennessee, where Suge has a house. And there's a whole big scene. It's very, very interesting. And essentially, Celie leaves and she goes to stay with Suge in her big house. And she tastes a different life and she learns things. She starts sewing pants, and that kind of becomes a business for her. And she learns to speak proper. And that completely different life. Occasionally she goes back to their town. Mister's cleaned up his act to an extent. Harpo's kind of cleaned up his act to an extent. He's taking care, because he has kids to take care of, and his kids are growing up. By the time this happens, Harpo and Sophia's youngest children are adults. So they're all grown up by this point. But then, let's see, Celie's pa, the man she grew up to, her stepfather, dies. Well, turns out he doesn't own anything. Except for, he has all the money. So she gets a call from the wife saying, so he's been dead like 2 weeks, and we went to the will and realized I have the money, the car, the furniture, but I don't own the land, the store, or the house, because it didn't belong to him. It belonged to Celie's father, who then passed to her mother. And then when her mother died, it passed to Celie and her sister Nellie. So Celie now has a house, a big fancy house, because he tore down the house she grew up in and built a big fancy house. So she now owns it because the land belonged to her. She had inherited years, pretty much when her mother died. So, as well as the store. So she now has money of her own. Around this time, now Grady leaves along with Squeak. He's been growing reefer, also known as marijuana. That's been going on for a while, and decides to go down to Panama and do that. And Squeak goes with him. Suge falls in love with a 19-year-old. Now, by the time she's in her 50s, I think, maybe 60s. So Celie's kind of heartbroken. It's like the woman she thought she was in love with has wandered off. Her relationship with Mr. has changed because, one, he has no power over her anymore, and they're getting old. And they're just not going to scream and yell at each other anymore because they're getting old and they have better things to do. And they've essentially become friends. She has all the letters at this point. And and then you have, at this point, the book is going back and forth. And what's going on with Nellie is Karina's died. She finds out the whole background stuff. Eventually, right before Karina dies, she's convinced that, no, they're not in love. No, they didn't have an affair. And yes, the kids who are now adults, are Nellie's niece and nephew. So by this time, however, again, the plantations have taken over. The people are either stuck in poverty and dying of malaria because they used to grow yams, and yams protected them from malaria, and I'm not quite sure why. They're also periodically coming up with sickle cell anemia, which, yes, it is connected to malaria, though they don't entirely make I think the science connection has made it. People with sickle cell anemia cannot catch malaria, so they didn't know this is 1920, so I wouldn't be surprised if the author did, if Alice Walker was aware of this connection. So, but these yams were essentially preventing them from getting sick, and now all their yam fields are gone, so they're getting sick and they're dying of malaria by the hundreds every rainy season, and they're living in these barracks, and their world has been destroyed. Now, the other thing that's been going on, this since the beginning, originally they weren't allowed to teach the girls. And there was this one girl who became really close friends with Olivia. And I cannot remember her name, even though I literally just finished reading the book. But it starts with a T. But her and Adam, Olivia and Adam, are very, very close friends with this girl. And originally her parents wanted nothing, basically Nellie and Olivia had nothing to do with her because she was friends with Olivia and Olivia was teaching her things. Then the father dies. The mother has already had multiple sons, so she's an official man. But then the road comes and pretty much destroys things. And the missionaries decide to Samuel, Nellie, and the two kids who are now older go to England to try to get help. And they can't because nobody cares. Basically, they don't care about this tiny little village in the middle of nowhere. They simply do not care whatsoever. So they go back, and the villagers, it's like, they welcome them, but then they realize, okay, you pretty much can't do anything. You're useless. And they didn't particularly like them in the first place. And Samuel has a crisis of faith because essentially he realizes that the natives look down on them. They don't see them as their own people. They don't acknowledge that their ancestors sold Nellie and Samuel's ancestors into slavery, and it's completely pointless. They don't care. But they go back anyway, teach the little kids, because the older kids are now being forced to work on the plantation in order to pay taxes and living and basically stuff like that. They're essentially enslaved. So, but when they get back, Adam, who's been mourning, he's in love with this African girl who they'd actually had a huge fight because the natives had started marking on the cheeks, scarring their children to mark their tribal knowledge, basically part of their tribe. And she does this while they're away, and she hides away because they'd had a big fight because he didn't want her to do it, along with the female genital mutilation, which was also going on. They were trying to stop those two things. I don't know if she goes through with that or not. It's not gone into detail. Now, the author has a background. She spent time in Africa. She's very much aware of fighting to end this. And no, I'm not going to go into it. It's gruesome. I did a class on violence against women in undergrad. Not going to go there. Moving on to the story. So, however, shortly after they get back and they find out what this girl did, her and her mother run off to basically the resistance movement into the forest. And Adam follows them because he's in love and he wants to marry this girl. And eventually they do come back, and without her, him and her come back because he's trying to convince her to marry him. And apparently he promises her mother he would take her to America and marry her. And eventually they get married because she kind of resisting him because she thinks that he'll abandon her because she knows in America that she's very, very dark skinned, that she's going to be shunned because they don't see her as beautiful. In America, even the African Americans don't see her very, very dark skin as beautiful. And then she has the scars on her face. Now Adam's gotten the scars on his face as well before they get married. That's how he convinces her to marry him. So they get married and they realize they can't do anything. And essentially they leave. They go back. But in the meantime, Celie's fallen out of love. Albert brings her a telegram from the State Department saying her sister and her husband, because she marries Samuel in England, so that have died in a ship. And it kind of goes on, kind of telling the rest of Celie's story and how she's eventually, Suge comes back. I don't know if her lover comes with her or not, but she comes back and everybody's kind of friends. Celie has a house, she has a business, she's relatively wealthy, and they're in their 60s at this point. And the end of the book ends with Nellie coming home with Samuel and the children and Adam's wife. So, and basically these girls have been separated since Celie was like 20 years old and Nellie was about 18. And now they're in their 60s. So this is the first time they're seeing each other for decades. Not knowing if their letters ever, because Celie literally started mailing letters to her sister and they all come back. So they had no clue anything about what was going on. Nellie had no idea what happened with Celie's life. I think she might have gotten some of the letters because otherwise she wouldn't have known basically where to go. Because they show up at Celie's house. And the sisters hug. And it's like, that's kind of how the book ends. And it's a wholesome ending. I enjoy this book. It's written in those diary formats. Once Celie gets the letters, you get the back and forth between Nellie's story and Celie's story of how these African Americans are living. This is a lot of times in the 1920s, 1930s, and how they're living and their love lives. You get the love affair between Albert and Suge, and then Suge and Celie, and then Suge's various other love affairs, because she's on the road and she's doing all sorts of things, and it's very interesting, and it's a wonderful book. It's extremely enjoyable. Like I said, I just finished rereading it, which is the reason I'm shooting this video now, and I was absorbed into it just like I was when I was in my late teens when I read this book. It's a fantastically well written book, and it has probably, I'm going to assume, considering the author is a famous African American writer, it's a good representation of the time period and the people, and you see pretty much the entire cast of this novel is African American. It talks about their history and their lives and their love affairs, and there's a little bit of the whites. You see the dominance with Sophia's story and how she raises this little girl, and this girl becomes obsessed with it. That's one of the things I didn't mention. Yeah, she raises this girl, Mary Ellen, and Mary Ellen's just kind of obsessed with her and will not leave her alone, even though she's no longer working for them. But they kind of have to play nice to the white people because this is the white mayor of the town. So, and eventually she's like, yeah, I'm not in love with your kid. I'm not. They also deal with one of Sophia's daughters with Harpo. Henrietta actually has sickle cell anemia. They don't say those words, but that's what they're describing. And it's very much implied by the author, knowing that modern authors would understand what she's talking about, because she has these bouts of where she's in intense pain, and it's a blood disease. So she doesn't say the words, but that's what it is. It's sickle cell anemia, which is common found in the United States and the African American communities, because they are descendant from the tribes in West Africa where malaria originated, and I've read articles on this. That is the connection, because sickle cell anemia is, though very much a disease, is a genetic abnormality created in human evolution to combat malaria. So its genetic purpose was and the reason it still got passed down is because it prevented why they were in intense pain. They were still able to pass his genes on because they didn't die of malaria, which is since the mosquitoes have gone everywhere. And we're still trying to get rid of them because it's malaria and it's very, very nasty. And yes, they do imply that both Nellie and Samuel and the children had contracted and then survived malaria when they first got there. So somehow they survived. That was said. And that, I'm not sure, it may have been what Corina ended up dying of. They call it the African missionary disease, but it also probably might have been yellow fever. But it doesn't actually say. She wastes away and dies. I'm assuming it's malaria. But that's the story. Again, it's very well written. It's very easy to read, but I would not recommend it for any kid younger than high school. It's just, it deals with some pretty intense topics, and I don't know if it would be entirely enjoyable, but that's my personal opinion. I'm not part of the African American community, so I can't judge when they would personally want to introduce their children to this book. I highly recommend it. It's really, 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 really good. It is. That's the reason I wanted to cover it, because it's on my mind and I wanted to reread it. And again, I borrowed it yesterday and I finished it this afternoon. I've been reading it all day because it's an enjoyable book, and it's a wonderfully interesting, complex story filled with really interesting, complex characters with different motivations. And it also shows there's no true evil, because again, Mr. starts out this evil person who's essentially raping Celie, and she becomes friends with him later in life. It's like they're in their 60s. It's like, the world has changed. You've changed. I've changed. We're moving on. And it is very interesting. It also has that lesbian love affair between Suge and Celia. And in fact, one point in time, Celia literally tells her that, tell Celia it's like you're still a virgin because you've never actually made love. Because essentially, sex with Albert was not love. He was imagining Suge and being mad at Celia because she wasn't Suge and just having sex with her for the sake of her being there. And the other thing, when it talks about God, and in the introduction, the author, Alice Walker, talks about this and how at the time of her writing, she envisioned God as the earth and the trees. And there's a line in there, she quotes this of Suge Avery, which is the vision of God. It's like, if God gets mad if you walk by the color purple and don't appreciate it. So that's how she views God, and how Celie's vision of God changes as she grows up and learns from Suge and grows older and sees it's more the old traditional African way. And that's the other thing that's covered in this book, where it talks about the different visions of religion and God and things like that, and how the African people see it. They had their old ancient gods and goddesses, and they were forced out of it, and that's explained in the introduction by the author. And it's talked about by Nellie, because they're in Africa and they're trying to convert these people, which they never do. And the other thing that they run into there before they leave there's some white missionary who's happily converting these people, and she's held up in great esteem. They run into her on their way back to England. She was a rich aristocrat who didn't want to get married and had a bunch of money and went off, and she wanted to write. So she went off to these missionaries, like, I don't want to convert you. I don't really care about what you whatsoever. I just want your money. I'll be able to build you a school and a hospital and a university and stuff like that, and pour my money into you. And basically, she buys the village land so she's able to protect these people. And at the beginning, she's treated like a man, so she's given 2 wives, which she raised and sent back to England to go to school and becomes a grandmother. And that's how they run into her on the ship. She has one of her grandchildren, and they're going to England because she sees war coming. So it's like, eventually the people are being enslaved. Eventually there's going to be some sort of war. which doesn't surprise me. They may be in the Congo, which makes me think, yeah, that becomes a very, very big mess. It becomes a very, very big mess. So, and I believe it's still a very, very big mess. But that's also one of the topics that's kind of covered throughout this book, which is, if you read about the author, she did spend time in Africa, so she is aware of this. And that type of life. She was very much involved in the civil rights movement. So she's an amazing author. I'm probably going to try to read some more of her books. I may review more of them. But again, this is more the teens, something your kids getting prepared to college kind of thing when you're looking at African American history and African American literature. This book won a Pulitzer, I believe, in '84, which is the year I was born. So it's very well known. It's very, very popular, and there's a good reason for it. No matter who you are, it's a very, very, very good book. And I love the way it's written and the way it flows and the story it tells. So I'm going to highly recommend this book. I am going to cover the Steven Spielberg film because I do enjoy it. And that was how I was introduced to this story. I saw it probably on television, and then I went after the book. And the book is better. Because of course it is. So I think the film came out maybe late 80s, early 90s. This was one of both Oprah and Whoopi Goldberg's. This is their first movie, and they were nominated. And of course they didn't win anything because they were black. And it was the Oscars. So in the late 80s, early 90s. I can't remember exactly what year it is. So I will cover the film. It's a very good film, but the book is better because of course it is. So again, I'm going to highly recommend this book, but again, depending on your understanding, your culture, I'm not going to recommend it for anybody who's under 9th grade, who's 14, 15, in that age range. Nothing younger than that, just because some of it's going to go over their head. Some of it's really violent and very, very dark. And again, it's not something I would want to expose my kids to just because of some of the stronger, older themes in there. But that's my opinion. That's just my personal opinion. But it is also a very long book. And yes, it's geared more toward adults and the teen age. It's an adult novel. So that's the other reason. But also very, very mature themes. The film is... there's stuff glossed over. I'll get to that when I cover the film. But that is it for this review. I'm going to be covering the Joy Luck Club as well. I will be filming that later. It's not filmed yet. I'm also going to be covering a mixture of both Asian and African American books, mostly younger children's books. This is the most intense book besides the Joy Luck Club that I'm covering this month. I'm also going to be covering some films, as well as possibly some other stuff. I haven't nailed the month of February completely down yet because it's June. So I'm just doing this video now because I just finished reading the book and it's fresh in my mind. If you like this review, in the month of January, I have done a bunch of food stuff. So I've covered some cookbooks and did a few other food things. Again, none of that has been filmed yet. That is still, as of this video, kind of up in the air. I have the cookbooks nailed down, but I don't have the rest of the stuff. December, I covered, if you want to late Christmas stuff, one or more reviews. I do a bunch of fun stuff. November, I did Native American stuff, which is both books and media, Smithsonian exhibition stuff. I've covered Harry Potter. I did a bunch of classical Halloween as well as kid Halloween stuff in October. Had a whole bunch of more book reviews, some travel stuff, from homeschooling stuff. But again, this month it's focusing on both African American and Asian history because it's February, and of course African American History Month, and it's also Chinese New Year. So those were I felt I needed to cover both of these areas. So like and subscribe if you want to see more of this. Check out some of my older stuff. This is very much a mixture of book review, but it's based on a secular homeschooling, so a non-religious homeschooling. So that is it. Again, like and subscribe. Thank you.